Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar looking at the topic of permitting to development for carbon capture and storage. I'm Eleanor, the Climate and Energy Manager at Ipieca. Ipieca is the Global Oil and Gas Association for advancing environmental and social performance across the energy transition. We have been championing good practice for over 50 years, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here today and would firstly like to share a special thanks to our webinar series partners, SPECC US Technical Section, SPE Gaia, OGCI, and IOGP. As part of this webinar series, we have held two webinars, one on social acceptance and another on CO2 enhanced oil recovery. We're also planning more webinars in this series, so please refer to Ipieca's homepage for more information about future events. We will put relevant links in the chat box. And today's webinar will be moderated by Shannon Gray, Ipieca's CCS Task Force Co-Chair. And before I pass over to him, I would like to cover some housekeeping items. So in terms of housekeeping, there will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And to ask a question, please access the Q&A to post questions there. Participants are unable to unmute or turn their camera on unless hosts enable permission. However, we encourage you to post questions into the Q&A function. The webinar will be recorded, as the recording will be shared to registrants after the webinar has concluded. Finally, the use of the external AI-powered recording transcription tools is prohibited, so please deactivate any you have installed now, and we will remove any we see from the meeting. That is all from me now. I will pass on to Shannon for some opening words. Thank you, everybody. And Shannon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Hello to everyone who's joining us for this webinar today from Ipieca. As Eleanor mentioned, my name is Shannon Gray. I have the honor to be Ipieca's CCS Task Force Co-Chair, where we like to gather folks such as yourselves at events such as these, where we discuss topics near and dear to our heart, at the heart of environmental policy, technology, and climate. Today we have a little bit of a different webinar. We typically have three speakers. At the end, we usually run out of time for questions. We've tried to reconfigure things today to allow for two speakers and more time for Q&A. I will be trying to guide the Q&A as much as we can. So if you have questions, as I mentioned, please put them in the chat. I'll be putting in a few myself to try and stir the pot, if you will. But we'll try and have a lively conversation at the end. So please stay for the full hour. And so I'd like to move on to introducing our speakers for today's webinar. We have two excellent speakers. Today's webinar, the first is David Reiner from the University of Cambridge. David has a very lengthy and distinguished background. I'm also fortunate enough to call him colleague. David and I work together at the International Civil Aviation Organization, where we work together trying to figure out what is the global approach to things such as carbon capture and storage regulations and policy decisions. Currently, David's a professor of technology and policy at the Judge Business School of the University of Cambridge. He's also the assistant director of Energy Policy Research Group at Cambridge. He is also a research associate for the Center of Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT, where his research focuses on political economy and technology policy, particularly energy climate change, including policy, economics, regulation, and public attitudes, with a particular emphasis on the social license to operate. I'll stop there for David's introduction because it can be quite lengthy at times. Our second speaker today is Zoe Sayre from the North Sea Transition Authority. Zoe is a geologist by background, has a varied career spanning consultancy, education, development, geology, and technical leadership. She transitioned her skills into the area of carbon storage after honing them in the oil and gas sector around the globe, including the North Sea. Since joining the North Sea Transition Authority, she worked on oil and gas assets before moving on to carbon storage, where she is a stewardship lead in the carbon transportation and storage team. Currently, she leads the stewardship of CS licenses to permit and beyond, including the recently permitted Track 1 projects. So today, I think we have a nice balance of the policy, I'll go so far as to call it the theory versus the ground truth from a geologist. So hopefully that will provide a nice mix for context. With that, I'll turn over to our first speaker, and Professor David Reiner. David Reiner.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that.
We can see it just fine.
Great. So I mean, I'm spending my 15 minutes basically setting Zoe up. And I just wanted to give people a bit of a background, particularly in the UK context of how we gotten here in terms of finally getting to FID, having followed this for many years. It's quite an accomplishment. But there's a number of, I would sort of point to kind of red flags and maybe green flags in the context of permitting, if we're thinking about looking at the history and learning from the history of where we've gotten to so far. So I suppose the first point, it sounds obvious, but the UK has largely switched from a narrow focus on CCS for power to thinking about CCS, particularly in the context of industrial decarbonization. Obviously, industry is a major contributor in terms of our emissions, but it's also very true that the price of decarbonizing many industrial sectors is very high. And so historically, we've kind of tended to say that maybe industry shouldn't be one of the first things that we should be focusing on. And that's why I think if you look historically, 20 odd years ago, when the UK first started looking at CCS, the focus was almost entirely on power. And so there's some very good reasons why we didn't prioritize industrial decarbonization. On the other hand, as has emerged over the last few years, there have been some good reasons for thinking about acting sooner. One is obviously the lead time associated with the infrastructure that would be needed. Another is kind of wrapped up in concerns over competitiveness and preserving what's left of industry, what's left of energy-intensive industry in advanced industrialized economies, particularly focused narrowly on specific areas, what we might call green industrial clusters. That sort of framing has gained some traction in a number of countries. And I would also argue, importantly, as a political scientist, that, there's quite a bit of leverage that some of these regions have in terms of the influencing the national politics. Arguably, that was true in the US, the last US election with some of those traditional manufacturing states. And it's obviously very true in the UK's context, as I'll show, in terms of these so-called red wall states that have gone back and forth between Labour and Conservative over the past decade or so. So I mentioned the focus on power. We in the UK have had essentially three stabs at this, three failed stabs at it, a narrow focus on power, and also a narrow focus on essentially winner take all. So we've had two major billion-pound competitions. One failed when there was an inability to kind of reach agreement between the government and the project developer, and then most recently in 2016 with the new Conservative majority government, they cancelled the project just up in Peterhead just before contracts were to be awarded. So we haven't had a very good 15-20-year run in the UK, and so and it's felt, having been very close to it, it's felt a bit like that. When we did some work up in Peterhead, for example, it was very striking. After the project was cancelled, we went up there with some trepidation, feeling that people would feel like, frustrated that government didn't deliver on what would have been a very large project in quite a small, one of the poorest communities in Scotland. And in fact, somewhat to my surprise, despite the Shell's just points about how well they've done in terms of community engagement, virtually nobody had even heard of carbon capture and storage. So I think that to me is quite telling. It says something about the nature of the way that CCS has engaged and the developers and the governments have engaged on the topic hasn't really landed, hadn't really resonated. And so there was a bit of a reboot that happened under Claire Perry, who was the energy minister at the time. A number of us in academia and industry, government, came together as part of the cost challenge task force that kind of produced this report in 2018. And rather than focusing on these kind of single competitions, the framing was much more on this idea that actually NGOs like Green Alliance and even regional organizations like Yorkshire Forward had advanced, which is the idea of thinking about this more on a cluster basis in terms of a regional development rather than in terms of kind of more narrowly focused on an individual power plant. And I think that completely changed the focus. The focus was then on let's separate out CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, have a business model for that, and then focus on having arguably a number of projects being able to go forward that would enable not just power, industrial decarbonization, but also importantly, greenhouse gas removal, which had also risen up the agenda over these past few years. And I think there was a willingness to look not just to CCS, but to a number of other models, what were considered successful models by the late 2010s, with offshore wind, with green financing, with the Thames Tideway and other kind of regulatory asset base models. It's also important to say, as I said, that we have these red wall seats that kind of have shifted between red for Labour and blue for Conservative. And many of these were in kind of really key manufacturing areas. So if you look at the tightest seats, the kind of the battleground constituencies, the battleground seats, they tended to be those with the highest level of manufacturing jobs. And that was kind of where these elections in the late 2010s turned on, and the most recent election in 2024. So, it's a sort of place that both parties would be keen to woo over, to win over. And I think there was, a very clear sense that kind of made the difference, that getting some traction in these constituencies like Teesside in the northeast rather, or up in the northwest of England as well, sort of Liverpool, Manchester area. I think it's also true we've tried to have some levels of public engagement. I helped co-chair a public dialogue that the government led in 2021, which got relatively positive views of CCS and the role that CCS could play. But these have been fairly one-off sort of efforts. What was true, though, as part of the rebooting was a fairly ambitious, fairly rapid timescale that the British government put together to develop two green industrial clusters at the start, and ultimately up to four industrial clusters by the 2040s. So the quite ambitious effort that by 2025 you would get 2 carbon capture clusters off the ground, which actually they have, and then by 2040 you'd have the world's first net zero cluster. So quite an ambitious timeline that the British government has tried to keep to, or even accelerate over the past few years. This gives you a sense geographically of where they are. I mean, it's important to say it's actually, compared to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a diminishing industrial emissions, but nevertheless, there are still a number of places where that's continued. Importantly, I think quite an important stage was the industrial decarbonization challenge that was something on the order of a couple of £100 million, which was then kind of roughly doubled or more than doubled by industry in terms of its co-funding, co-financing, essentially getting projects up to the point when they're ready to go to a final investment decision. So, essentially what's needed for at the feed study level. And this gives you a sense of the map of where these projects were developed. I think it was quite important that it's not just a matter of a single project, but to think of it in terms of the cluster rather than project A or project B. And so again, there's kind of quite ambitious effort with, as I said, about a couple £100 million in public funding and the equivalent in co-investment from the private sector. And that led to finally by 2023 this announcement of the two major clusters that would be moving forward. The first step was in terms of the TNSCos, the transport and storage companies in the North Sea, the East Coast cluster, and then in the Liverpool Bay, the HyNet cluster. And then I think what's, to me, even more interesting in the next step, which is getting the various capture sites going. That has been challenging, but there has been some progress in that regard as well. And then I think importantly, as I say, it's not just about the two leading clusters, but then there's also the track 2 clusters, which are primarily up in Scotland, the Acorn and Viking clusters, which were announced in June of last year. It's also, I think, striking and I think important that what these clusters have been able to do is allow for some flexibility. So even between that first announcement in 2023 and most recently in 2025, some of the projects have not quite come and gone, but kind of risen up the level of the kind of priority negotiation list. And there's kind of a number of different projects that are going to be put forward. Personally, I'm not necessarily expecting that all of these priority projects would go forward, would be able to reach agreement with government. But just the mere fact that there's a significant number of them means that there's a good chance that there will be quite some number of projects that will be able to go forward. I think it's important in terms of public communications as well that there's been some really good efforts to try and clarify how what the sort of benefits that will be to local communities in terms of jobs and as well as in terms of economic development and emissions reductions. I'll just skip through these, but I just wanted to make a couple of quick final points in terms of where we are in terms of policy. There's been some striking pushback, and if you want, from both the left and the right with regard to the development of carbon capture and storage. You had a number of scientists as well as NGOs and environmentalists like George Monbiot essentially saying that this is a distraction. It's undesirable to be moving forward with this. It's kind of this white elephant, and that's in the face of the current government when they took power in mid-2024, going forward, one of their first big announcements was this £22 billion announcement on with regard to Teesside in the northeast and HyNet in the northwest. On the other hand, there have been some other striking concerns, not just from the left or the environmentalists, but also from the populist right. And so there have been concerns, and there's a new Reform MP from the Northwest. One of the first things she did was to kind of rail against HyNet and net zero. So I think that's one dimension of the challenges, and I think another challenge, which is what encountered on Teesside, was when the hydrogen plant was essentially swapped out for a data center. The debates over whether we how quickly, how fast we should be moving forward on a number of these different projects. So I think there's been some really important advances in terms of structuring this entire process, but there are also some looming, if not flashing bright red, then lots of flashing yellow lights that we need to take heed of. I think there's been quite a successful reframing. I think there's been some good engagement with local communities, but in the kind of current moment of a fairly strong populist left and a populist right, there's a question of how we kind of frame these projects to take them forward, which will obviously affect the politics, but also the more detailed questions of permitting. And I think I'll end there and turn it over to Zoe.
Thanks, David. That was a great presentation and a good foundation, as you mentioned, for my talk, which is now going to dive into the detail of the current status we are in at the moment and how you go about getting a carbon storage permit and what a carbon storage permit is and involves, and then a little bit about our future. So I'm hoping the slides are showing now. Just to introduce myself, I'm Zoe Sayer. I'm a geologist by background. I've had a varied career looking at lots of reservoirs across the world from an oil and gas point of view. I've been quite passionate throughout my career about transferable skills, and I've basically decided to demonstrate how these skills can be transferred moving over into carbon storage, which is similar but also very different to oil and gas, and it's those differences that are key. My current role is in the North Sea Transition Authority, which is the offshore regulator for oil, gas, carbon storage and hydrogen. I'm the stewardship lead in the carbon transportation and storage team, and as Shannon mentioned at the beginning, our team look after the carbon storage licenses as they approach permit application. We deal with the permit decisions on those applications, and following the granting of the first 4 carbon storage permits, we are now also stewarding the licenses as they go towards execute, or through execute, as they go towards first operations. So for those of you who are less familiar with us at the NSTA, our aim is to realise the potential of the North Sea by supporting UK energy security, reducing emissions from UK production, and also accelerating the transition to net zero, which is what my role in CCS is part of. The North Sea's got potential to deliver on net zero growth opportunities and put the UK at the forefront of the energy transition. We've got a really skilled offshore workforce and extensive offshore infrastructure that can be and is being repurposed for carbon capture, and also has potential for carbon capture and storage, and also has the potential for hydrogen storage as well. So why do we need CCS? David's given us a good overview of industrial carbonisation, but from an emissions point of view, top left here, I've got an illustration of the EU emissions. The EU is not actually showing on the slide, unfortunately, which is 4.68 gigatons. These are 2021 emissions. I think they have actually gone up since then. And of that, the UK is just under 0.4 gigatons. The capacity we've got in the North Sea at the moment, estimated by the BGS CO2 stored database, is around 78 gigatons of CO2. Now, like in-place oil and gas, maybe not all that is actually viable, but we've got a lot of storage offshore in the North Sea. And of that, 10 gigatons is in depleted fields. So we know the reservoirs are there. We know they have stored hydrocarbons in the past. We know they are accessible. They have infrastructure. And then 68 gigatons is in what we call saline aquifers. These are the sandstones offshore that have never actually contained oil and gas. but there's a very large volume of rock out there that has the potential to have CO2 put into it. The map on the right here shows the current CS licenses. Just point out a few of the projects. These red blobs here over in Liverpool Bay, the lower ones are the HyNet project. The Endurance project is in this area of the central North Sea. Those are the 2 track ones that are permitted. And then the track 2s, we've got Acorn up here in the central North Sea and Viking, which is down here in the southern North Sea. The rest of the red squares that I haven't highlighted, those are licenses that were granted in the first CS licensing round, where we granted 21 new licenses, and there was heavy competition for those, and they're a mixture of aquifers and depleted fields. The second licensing round is currently open for applications, and there are 14 locations available, some close to these existing areas and others in areas that haven't yet been licensed for carbon storage. So just a summary of the current projects. David's already mentioned Endurance and HyNet. So Endurance is a saline aquifer in the southern North Sea. So it didn't previously contain oil and gas. That takes CO2 from industries in Teesside and Humberside. And that's going to store up to 100 megatons of CO2 over its currently permitted 25-year life. HyNet, though it's a single project, it's actually 3 separate permits. Each store requires its own permit, and HyNet will store CO2 in 3 depleted gas fields in Liverpool Bay, and each of those has its own permit. It's taking CO2 from industries in northwest England and North Wales, and more than 100 megatons are planned to be injected over the 25 years of that permitted store life. The 2 other track projects that are heading towards permit but not yet permitted are the Acorn, also known as the Scottish Cluster, which is in the central North Sea, is in the sort of outer Moray Firth area, which will take emissions from various parts of Scotland, St Fergus, Peterhead, central Scotland. And that's actually going to be transported 102 kilometres offshore to a depleted field via the previous oil and gas GoldenEye pipeline. That's got a planned injection of 4 megatons a year, which is just over 40 megatons over the lifetime of the store. And then the other track 2 project in the southern North Sea is the Viking CCS project, which takes CO2 from industries at Immingham and the surrounding area, which is Humberside. It's going to have a mixture of new and repurposed infrastructure. So there's a new pipeline which will then connect with an existing subsea pipeline that will transport the CCS off to the facilities, where it's going to be stored in a depleted gas reservoir. And that's around 10 megatons planned per year by 2030, with a total of around about 80 megatons storage. So already we've permitted up to 200, well, we've permitted just over 200 megatons, with another, what's that, about another 150 in the pipeline. So how do you get a storage permit? Once you have a license, it's divided into a series of terms, each of which has a number of phases. So when you get a license, it's in the appraisal term, and this is similar to oil and gas. The expectation is that your licensed area will be appraised. You will gain understanding of the subsurface, the potential for storage, collect data. There may be some license commitments like drilling wells or shooting seismic to collect data and basically understand the subsurface and the potential development concepts that will lead to a carbon store. The first CO2 storage licenses are currently in the appraise phase, one leading towards full site characterization. Once they have site characterization, they then move into the assess phase, where any final data analysis is carried out, Dynamic models are refined to get a, an even finer understanding of the subsurface. And during this phase, the CO2 transportation and facilities concept is selected. So before that's selected, the refinement of the subsurface can't be finalised because it all needs to be understood in the context of the potential development and the operating conditions of the store. So the Track 2 Acorn project is currently in this assess phase where they're still finalising the development concept. That has to be finalised at the end of assess, and associated with that, the site and complex also has to be characterised by the end of assess, after which you move into define, where the development plan and the implementation plan for that project is fully optimised, and during this stage you apply for your storage permit application. And the Viking Track 2 store is currently in the define phase, heading towards a permit application. In the event of a successful application and the decision to grant a permit, that is done at the end of the define phase, after which the licence moves into the operational term, which is subdivided into the execute and the operate phases. During the execute phase, which both of the track ones currently sit in, the development is built and the operating plan is finalised. And there are various commitments, which I'll go into in a minute, that are required during the execute phase. Oh, sorry, I just touched my mouse, change slide. Before you can move into the operate phase, which is where, and that starts at the moment of first injection. So first injection is the moment the first molecules of CO2 are put into the ground, and that is the start of the operate phase. Currently, the permits are to store for 25 years. So the expected operating phases at the moment is 25 years, after which the site will close and move into post-closure phase, which is when decommissioning happens and monitoring of the CO2 plume for a period of time to demonstrate that it is stable and is permanently contained. Once that's finished, then the license ends. So in order to apply for a storage permit, there are a number of documents that need to be submitted. The storage operator needs to be approved. So not anybody can become a storage operator. There are certain financial and business hoops you need to jump through to be approved as a storage operator, very similar to oil and gas operators. The site and complex has to be defined and fully characterised. The definition means you are actually stating where in the subsurface your CO2 is going to be stored, and where the complex includes the seals that are going to actually contain that CO2 in the sandstone storage unit. So they have to be fully characterised. So we need to understand the geology, we need to understand the fluid flow, we need to understand the effects of temperature, any fracturing, any faulting. And then that has to be understood in the conditions of the store operation, which is all laid out in the carbon storage development plan. So this outlines the pressures it's going to go to, the quantities and the composition of the CO2, the facilities that are going to be used, any opportunities for reuse or repurposing. These all come together and have to be risk assessed, because a permit is granted based on, it's highlighted at the bottom here, that the fact that there is no significant risk of leakage or of harm to the human health or of harm to the environment. And those are that's the statement that comes from both the EU directive that was brought into the UK 2010 carbon storage regulation. So that is what the assessment for a storage permit is carried out on the basis of. So the containment risk assessment really is a key document. And in that risk assessment carried out by the applicant, they have to demonstrate that there is no significant risk of leakage from the store and that the CO2 will be permanently contained. The containment risk assessment, in order to demonstrate that there's been no leakage, the store needs to be monitored. So it feeds into the monitoring plan. And if anything unexpected happens, there has to be a series of corrective measures laid out. Monitoring is expected to be carried out, and this has to be updated every 5 years. The corrective measures may or may not be needed, depending on what actually happens once injection starts, but the operator needs to show that they have thought about how they will correct any irregularities or leaks should they happen. They also need to lay out their plans for post-closure. Obviously, this is a long time in the future, so it's just a provisional post-closure plan, but indications of when and how facilities will be decommissioned and any wells or other equipment that may be left in place to monitor the store post-closure. And then finally, we assess the financial security for the project to ensure it's paid for, and also the financial soundness of the proposed operator. In addition, there are other regulatory requirements that from different regulators. DESNZ OPRED need to assess the environmental statement, give approval for that. There needs to be an economic license for funding of whatever state that funding is. Crown Estate or Crown Estate Scotland need to grant a Crown lease for the activities on the seabed. And in some areas, particularly in the devolved authority, a marine licence is also needed. And then finally, there's the offshore HSE requirements. And these are all needed before operations can begin. So you've got your permits. What comes next? And this is where the 2-track 1 projects are. You move into execute, which is the project build and the preparation for first injection. Now, the permits, when they're granted, contain a series of conditions. It's laid out how much you can inject, what rates you can inject, and the pressures you can go up to. But in addition to that, there are a number of sort of general and store specific conditions. The store-specific ones may be related to certain monitoring or studies you need to carry out before first injection. And one of the other conditions that are included are related to legacy wells, and those all of which have to be abandoned prior to first injection, or if they're going to be reused for injection, repurposed for injection, that has to be done appropriately. And it's worth noticing that legacy wells includes current petroleum wells. These can't be left open during CO2 injection. They have to either be abandoned or repurposed appropriately to the CO2 standards. The operator should also determine what consents are needed and obtain them. So there may be PWA, which is Pipeline Works Authorisation, WONS for wells, the Wells Offshore Notification System, vent consents, etc. And that's up to the operator to apply for and obtain those. In addition, there may be data requirements prior to first injection, such as base level seismic for monitoring, maybe the well data from drilling the injection wells and any monitoring wells should be incorporated into static and dynamic models, all of which may need to be updated. If first injection is more than 5 years after permit award, the monitoring plan will also need to be updated, because this needs to be done every 5 years after permit award. And if any surprising data comes in from seismic or wells, there may need to be updates, and that's where NSTA stewardship comes in. It's constant conversations with the operator to work out what needs to be done in order to meet first injection. And then finally, the operator needs to submit plans for storage site management, how the site's going to be commissioned, and how the CO2 is going to be metered and measured, both for understanding what goes into the ground and also for ETS purposes. And the operator needs to confirm that financial security has come into effect. And these are the 4 final requirements are done at least 6 months prior to first injection, and guidance is going to be coming out on those in the very near future. And then finally, it will move, once CO2 has gone into the ground, we move into the operational term, where monitoring and injection data is gathered, and we'll learn about the store behaviour. Models will need to be updated. The risks may need to be updated. The store will be analysed to see whether it's conforming to predictions, or if any corrective measures are needed if the store behaves in a different way to expected. There may be the requirement for permit modifications if things aren't going as planned. There are requirements for data reporting and plan updates throughout the life of the store. There are annual data reporting requirements during injection. And I've already mentioned changes and modifications. Some could be positive. We may want to extend the store. It may want to increase its life. Some may be negative. Things may not go as planned and changes may need to be made. You may need more wells. You may need to shut in wells. There's no set time frame for closure and post-closure, though there are values stated in the regulations. I think it's 20 years for post-closure, and the permits at the moment are for 25 years, depending on store performance and post-closure, whether the plume has been shown to be stable and contained. Those timelines can vary. You know, if you think about oil and gas, a lot of fields have actually gone on much longer than initially expected. That may happen for CCS. We don't yet know, and we'll learn a lot of lessons during operations, both from the UK stores and also globally. Oh, sorry. And then finally, after the post-closure period, which at the moment is stated as 20 years, the store is handed over to the competent authority. Financial liabilities for post-closure and beyond are planned to be mitigated by a decommissioning fund, which builds up over the store life to cover the entity once there are no revenue streams. And finally, in order for the site to be handed over to the competent authority, it must be demonstrated to be sealed in perpetuity. And I guess execute and operate, you know, this is our future. There's going to be a lot to learn once stores are operational, and learnings that can be incorporated into future projects. And seeing how the CO2 actually behaves compared to predictions is going to transform the landscape and might lead to, you know, complete changes in operations. And if you think back to how we understand oil and gas now compared to the 1970s, thanks to varying data and advances in technology, I think this is a very exciting time for carbon storage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for your presentation. And can I now ask my two presenters to come back on camera? Okay. All right. So the Q&A session will be moderated by myself. It'll be roughly for the next 15 minutes or so. I think we have until the top of the hour, although we may not need it. We're going to try and prioritize questions from the audience. You guys have been watching the Q&A chat. I've been kind of peppering them as we go, but I'm going to try and get ones from the listeners. And so we're going to start, Zoe, I think a few for you. So if you're ready, I'll go ahead and jump in.
Yep, go for it.
So the first one, which is a question that I see a lot in the CCS, especially in the permitting and the regulatory space, it's a question about guidance. The question is, could you please share any guidance documents or an agnostic list required to prepare for permit or transportation and storage when it comes to A, onshore storage, or B, offshore storage?
Yeah, so first of all, we are not the onshore storage regulator, so I can't answer the question in that respect. We are only the offshore storage regulator. We do have published guidance on how to apply for a carbon storage license, what the process is to apply for a carbon storage permit, and also details on the contents of a carbon storage permit application. And those are all available on our public website. The applications for carbon storage license guidance has recently been updated, and we're currently working on updating the permit application, both sets of guidance for that, based on learnings from the track 1 process. So excellent. On our website in the carbon storage area.
Excellent. And
can I just add on?
Please do.
Oh, sorry. Can I just add on onshore? I mean, I think to date the UK has been quite, I don't know, good is the right word, but quite focused on offshore licensing and offshore storage, which I mean in the UK context is quite abundant. You know, previous efforts on onshore storage in Europe have been, you know, inevitably ended in failure in Germany and in the Netherlands and so on. So I think there's a difference between kind of technical guidance documents, which may, you know, which do well exist with regard to onshore storage, but the actual realistic potential of it moving forward, I think, are vanishingly small.
Thank you for the helpful political context, David. Always appreciated. One other quick list of these potential guidance documents for those of you trying to understand more about permitting or subsurface geologic sequestration in general. The IPCC's, I think it's either 2005 or 2006 special report on CCS does an excellent job for an overview. I know that the EU has some guidance document out there. I believe DNV recently published some guidance, I think, for the EU in general, and I think some of the spirit of that was incorporated into the UK regs from 2010. So there may be some generic, I'll say, guidance there, but I'm guessing if you're looking at the UK, go to Zoe's website, look at UK specifics, but in general, there is a lot out there.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to clarify on that. Yes, the EU guidance is there. It is very useful and interesting, but we in the UK operate under the UK regs, so it is
Right.
the UK guidance you need to follow. Not all the EU guidance content is necessarily directly applicable, even though the regs are equivalent.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification, Zoe. Okay. We have another question here. Zoe, this is another one for you. And it has to do with streamlining permitting. The question is there any work ongoing between, I'm going to say a series of acronyms now, I'm hoping you can catch them.
I do know them all, yes.
Good. NSTA, DESNZ, OPRED HSE, the Crown Estate Planning Inspectorate, and others to streamline the overall process of permitting and licensing for CCS in the UK. It is quite complex.
It is quite complex, yes. So firstly, I've already mentioned that even within the NSTA, we're aware that what we do can be complex, and we have done a series of after action reviews from the track ones to try and help streamline that, and that's led to our updated guidance. Yes, there are conversations going on between, I think, all of those acronyms and basically the other regulators regarding reducing regulatory burden. I can't comment directly on any of them because I'm not actually involved directly in any of them, but yes, there is work ongoing. We're aware it's complex, we're aware there's duplication, and I think everybody would like to reduce that if possible.
So one question maybe from more of the practical side, in the slides that you showed, that first kind of application assessment period, that first section had a timeline between, I think you guys have seen between 6 and 10 years in order to do that assessment. In terms of the lion's share of that time, where do you think that is? Is that in data collection? Is that in review? Is that in education? Is that in communication?
It varies from store to store. I mean, the high end of that store, David illustrated that really nicely. I like endurance, for example, has had various manifestations throughout the political landscape and has taken a long time to get to where it is today. As we work on more permits, we are learning more, refining the process. So I would expect that some of the newer licenses will proceed much quicker. Some of the licenses don't have a lot of data, so they will actually need to go out and acquire data. That takes time. It takes time to acquire seismic, process it, interpret it, incorporate it into the models. Just a seismic shoot to a dynamic model could be 3 to 4 years. Wells take time to drill, analyze. If you need hard rock data, some of the tests required for CO2, those lab tests can take a long time. So there is a lot of data collection. Some of the time can also be in iteration of the actual information that comes into the regulators. We don't just need a statement of this is fine. We actually need evidence as to why it's fine. So the more clarity that can be given in the documents that are presented to us, that helps speed up the process as well. So it's a mixture. It varies from store to store and license to license, depending on the geology and the maturity of the understanding.
Excellent. Thank you. And David, there was another question, I think, in terms of the, I mean, maybe going back to the endurance example, it sounds like there's a question in the chat looking at, is the permitting process, I think the question was phrased, putting, the public subsidies for CCS in jeopardy. And I would kind of rephrase that as, do we think the permitting process in its current state is longer than the political process? So it kind of causes the mismatch.
There is definitely a tension. I mean, and if it does extend too long, that can be problematic. I mean, I can think of this even in the context of the some of the FID for the first projects in the UK. I mean, there was the summer election in 2024 caught everybody by surprise, and I think one of the reasons why one of Ed Miliband's first things that he did in October 2024 was to announce this 22 billion for CCS was because the time it was taking to get everything sorted out on the government side was starting to make industry a bit nervous. So I think there is that tension about aligning timelines, and I think that can be a danger, and we've seen it in other countries as well. So I think that is one of the challenges. It's not just for industry to make their lives easier by having fewer acronyms to engage with, but it is kind of that can potentially kill off projects because it just takes too long to sort things out.
Sure. Yeah, it is complex. I would imagine potentially a good analog we could look back to would maybe be in the early days of maybe offshore oil and gas exploration, right? And how those timelines have come down. There may be some analogs there. Daryl, if you're on, that may be an interesting thing to talk about at Ipieca Week, and how maybe we could look at that. We'll take that away. What last, I think, UK question, and it looks like we have some questions going out in more generic permitting and then kind of other political landscapes for CCS. David, I think this one is for you, but so if you have any insight, please feel free. And it says, do you see UK policy changing to include the U aspects of CCUS, such as CO2-based EOR, into the decarbonization strategy? What else can make CO2 storage economically sustainable in the United Kingdom?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, we've tended to shy away from EOR to date, partly because of the focus on the offshore, which makes EOR a bit more challenging than in the onshore context, like you would have in the US. And again, historically, you haven't had the same support that, for example, US EOR has had from through the tax code and so on. So I don't see a huge amount of enthusiasm for EOR. I mean, I think folks in Edinburgh and other places have looked at this as a potential, and I think it is viable technically. I think it's more just a question of whether the policy would be willing to move forward on that. It's in many ways it's a question of where you end up putting your support. And as I said, I think in the UK context, the idea of finding more money down your trouser pocket for industrial capture support, I think would be maybe more where the focus would be, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
No, I'd agree with David. I think that there's a policy issue with EOR, CO2 EOR. So, but otherwise, I don't really have anything to add on that.
Okay, and it sounds like, yeah, it is a policy choice. It seems like from a technical perspective, it seems like maybe some merit, but again, it seems like, what is the goal of the policy, right? The UK seems very much in terms of, we're going to try and do sequestration offshore, and we're going to try and decarbonize the economy, right? Other political spectrums we've seen kind of are shifting in recent times. And so to that vein, David, I think this question falls on nicely. Talking about the visibility of social license challenges taking place in places such as the United States, could you please give us your thoughts on what you would do differently if you are an operator hoping to start a CCS project here, and I'm guessing they're meeting from the United States.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is, as opposed to the UK or Europe, where onshore storage is not really viable. I do think that that's much more feasible in the US context. I think it is, I don't know, a positive thing, but in the context of lots of other things to do with climate policy completely falling by the wayside, this. CCUS does seem one of the few areas where there has been continued, bipartisan support in the U.S. for this going forward, and I think fairly generous subsidies that have or generally generous support mechanisms that have actually increased over the last few years. That doesn't mean, as we've seen, that there aren't individual locations where they run into NIMBY issues. I think particularly things which are where the transport ends up going across several states causes problems, as is often the case with transmission lines or other things, where the folks in the middle don't really see the benefits, and so they see only small potential risks, and so they oppose some of these transport projects. So I think that would be the question as to whether you can design some of these things, finding a way to compensate local communities that are kind of along the along those sort of pathways, because I think that has been kind of the one area where I think there has been some pushback at the community level, at the local level.
Got it. Which is probably very different from the offshore experience, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think we have 4 minutes left here. Question coming back around for Zoe. I think I've gotten to most of the questions in the chat from the audience. If you missed your question, we'll try and answer it. There's a few more here. Zoe, I think this one was for you. Do you have any updates on the second CS licensing round?
Yeah, it's currently open for applications. There are 14 areas up for offer. It's a mixture of depleted fields and saline aquifers. The closing date for that is hang on, I wrote it down, 24th of March. So if any operators are interested in applying, all the information is on our website. There's a pinned link on the homepage of the NSTA website.
Excellent. I think we got about 3 minutes left, but I think we've reached a nice conclusion to the questions. I don't see too many more. Let's see. We got one more in. Let's see. I think this one, doing maybe for you. It's how does permitting differ for projects that rely on multiple transport options?
So at the moment in the UK, there's only pipeline transport. So in terms of the future for that, I'm afraid I can't answer. The different transport options, they would just be part of the carbon storage development plan. So providing it was a viable concept and that the different transportation options were laid out clearly, then I don't think the permit would differ, because the carbon storage development plan would be approved in whatever state and whichever transport options are there.
Okay. My guess is that question may be, going towards potential pipelines, subsea pipelines, and potential maritime shipping of CO2 as well.
Mm-hmm.
We see some of those projects starting to kick off. Northern Lights is in operation. It sounds like from the storage side itself and the subsea, the storage is agnostic to where it's coming from as long as it gets there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think that was the last one. Thank you, Zoe, for letting me squeeze that in. Zoe, David, any closing comments? Anything you'd like to add before we do our sign off?
Just from my side, I mean, I think it's, I think we are finally seeing real projects, and I think it's quite an exciting time, but that also means that that there are big challenges in terms of getting these permits done in as efficient a manner as possible, so that they're taken over the projects are taken over the finish line.
Yeah, I'd agree with David. It is a very exciting time. These are the first, hopefully, of many. And yeah, I just look forward to seeing what happens in the future.
Excellent. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for kind of our third CCS webinar in this series of permitting and review and technology sharing. If you didn't get your questions, we'll try and follow up via email. And if there's any follow up, feel free to reach out. Ipieca is always here to educate and to provide guidance. Thank you all very much, and thank you to the panelists. You guys were fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.